At 6:17 on the morning of November 21st, 1943, Private First Class Marcus Holland crouched in a coral foxhole on Betio Island, watching a Marine gunnery sergeant crawl forward into the killing zone. The sergeant, a man with 3 stripes on his sleeve and the hardened look of a veteran who had survived Guadalcanal, moved with agonizing slowness, inching his body through the pulverized sand and shattered palm fronds that littered the beachhead. Holland, a 22-year-old farm boy from Kansas, gripped his rifle until his knuckles turned white. His breath caught in his throat as he waited for the inevitable crack that would signal another death. For 4 days, the Battle of Tarawa had raged with a ferocity that defied comprehension, a meat grinder of machine gun fire and artillery that had turned the tiny atoll into a charnel house, where survival was measured in seconds. But it wasn't the artillery or the banzai charges that terrified Holland the most. It was the silence, the eerie, pregnant pauses between the explosions, where the invisible hand of the Japanese sniper reached out to claim another life. The sergeant raised his head, just for a moment, to scan the enemy lines, and in that split second, the air cracked with a single, sharp report that echoed across the lagoon. The sergeant's head snapped back violently, a spray of crimson mist erupting into the humid air before his body slumped lifelessly into the sand. Another casualty added to the growing list of men cut down by an enemy they could not see. Holland didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink, his mind racing through the grim calculus of the battlefield where every movement was a gamble and every exposed inch of skin was a target. The Japanese defenders, elite troops from the Special Naval Landing Forces, had turned Betio into a fortress of hidden death, honeycombing the island with spider holes, reinforced bunkers, and camouflaged positions that were invisible until the muzzle flash revealed them. 800 snipers, trained for years in the art of concealment and patience, lay in wait across the atoll, turning the palm trees and coral ridges into killing grounds where American Marines were being picked off one by one with terrifying precision. This was not warfare as Holland had imagined it, not the grand sweeping maneuvers of armies clashing on open fields, but a brutal, intimate game of cat and mouse played out in the dirt and blood of a Pacific island. To understand the nightmare unfolding on Tarawa, we must look beyond the immediate horror of the beachhead and delve into the meticulous, obsessive preparation that the Japanese Empire had invested in its sniper program. Since the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army had recognized the value of individual marksmanship as a force multiplier, establishing specialized sniper schools that produced some of the deadliest shooters in the world. Candidates were selected for their patience, their eyesight, and their ability to blend seamlessly into their environment, undergoing rigorous training that emphasized stealth, camouflage, and the psychological impact of the unseen killer. By 1943, these snipers had been deployed across the Pacific theater, armed with the Arisaka Type 97 rifle and a philosophy that prioritized the mission over survival. On Betio, they had spent months preparing their positions, constructing elaborate hides in the crowns of palm trees, digging spider holes connected by underground tunnels, and creating firing lanes that covered every approach to the island's defenses. They were ghosts in the machine, invisible warriors who could strike from anywhere and vanish before the enemy could react. The morning roll call on the 21st of November revealed the devastating effectiveness of this strategy, a grim litany of names absent from the ranks, men who had been alive the night before but were now cold and still in the sand. 47 Marines had been killed by sniper fire in the first 72 hours of the battle, a statistic that sent a chill through the command staff aboard the assault ships offshore. These were not casualties from random shell fragments or massed machine gun fire, but specific targeted killings that decapitated leadership and paralyzed movement. Officers and NCOs were primary targets, their distinct silhouettes and behavior marking them for death, leaving platoons leaderless and confused in the chaotic inferno of the landing zones. The snipers fired once, maybe twice, from a concealed position and then relocated or simply waited, their discipline absolute, their patience infinite. American counter-sniper teams, hastily assembled and thrown into the fray, found themselves chasing shadows, firing blindly into the jungle canopy, or blasting suspected positions with flamethrowers and grenades, often with little effect. Holland watched as a team of Marines attempted to flank the position where the sergeant had fallen, moving with a desperate urgency that betrayed their fear. They threw smoke grenades to mask their advance, the thick gray clouds billowing across the sand, but the Japanese sniper was already gone, having slipped away through a network of trenches to a new firing point 50 yards down the line. When the smoke cleared, another shot rang out, and another Marine dropped, clutching his throat as the life drained out of him. The frustration was palpable, a physical weight that pressed down on every man on the beach, the sense of helplessness fueling a simmering rage that threatened to boil over into reckless action. Holland knew that something had to change, that the standard tactics of suppress and maneuver were failing against an enemy who refused to play by the rules. He thought back to the wheat farm in Kansas, to the hot summer days spent protecting the harvest from the crows that descended in black clouds to strip the fields bare. The problem of the crows was a matter of survival for the Holland family, a threat to their livelihood that required a solution beyond simply shooting into the sky. His father, a taciturn man who wasted neither words nor ammunition, had taught Marcus the art of deception, the subtle game of misdirection that turned the predator's instincts against him. "Don't shoot at the crows," his father had said, handing him the worn Winchester rifle. "Let them waste their energy chasing nothing." They had built decoys, simple constructs of straw and old clothes mounted on wooden crosses, and placed them strategically in the fields to draw the birds' attention. When the crows swooped down to investigate the intruders, committing themselves to a flight path they could not easily alter, Marcus would be waiting in the trees, his rifle ready. It was a lesson in psychology as much as marksmanship, understanding that even the cleverest enemy could be tricked into revealing themselves if you offered them a target they couldn't resist. As Holland sat in the foxhole, the memory of those Kansas fields merged with the reality of the Pacific battlefield, sparking an idea that was as simple as it was dangerous. The Japanese snipers were like the crows, disciplined but predictable in their own way, driven by a doctrinal mandate to engage targets of opportunity. They were trained to shoot at movement, at silhouettes, at the distinctive shape of an American helmet rising above a parapet. What if, Holland thought, the Marines stopped being the targets and started being the decoys? What if they could trick the snipers into revealing their positions by offering them something that looked like a kill but was nothing more than a hollow shell? He looked at the helmet of the dead sergeant lying in the sand, the small puncture hole in the steel, a testament to the sniper's accuracy, and saw not a tragedy, but a tool. Holland grabbed his own helmet and a bayonet, his movements deliberate as he began to construct his deception. He pierced the crown of the helmet with the blade, the steel screeching in protest, and mounted it on the end of a long stick he scavenged from the debris. It was a crude effigy, a caricature of a soldier, but at 50 yards through the haze of battle, it would be indistinguishable from the real thing. He turned to the other men in the foxhole, Corporal Russo and Private Bennett, and explained his plan, his voice low and urgent over the roar of the surf. Russo, a tough kid from Brooklyn, who had seen too many friends die, looked at the makeshift puppet with skepticism, then at Holland with a dawning realization. "Show me," Russo said, his eyes narrowing as he grasped the potential of the trick. They positioned themselves at the edge of the foxhole, Russo with his rifle trained on the tree line, Bennett scanning with binoculars, and Holland preparing to play the puppeteer. Slowly, agonizingly, Holland raised the helmet above the rim of the foxhole, mimicking the cautious movement of a Marine peering over the edge to check his front. He tilted it slightly, turning it left and right, as if scanning the terrain, adding a trembling motion to simulate the fear and adrenaline of a man under fire. For a long moment, nothing happened, the jungle remaining silent and impenetrable, and Holland began to doubt his own ingenuity. Then a single shot cracked through the air, and the helmet jerked violently on the stick, spinning around from the impact of the bullet. "Got him!" Bennett shouted, pointing to a cluster of palm fronds high up in a tree to their left. "Muzzle flash, 10 o'clock, about 40 feet up." Russo didn't hesitate, unleashing a rapid burst of fire into the designated spot, the rounds tearing through the vegetation and splintering the wood. A moment later, a dark shape tumbled from the tree, crashing through the branches to land with a heavy thud on the jungle floor. The success of the ruse was immediate and electrifying. a victory snatched from the jaws of helplessness that spread through the platoon like wildfire. They had tricked the trickster, used his own discipline against him, and turned the hunter into the hunted. Emboldened by the kill, Holland and his team began to refine the technique, constructing more elaborate decoys using sandbags and torn uniforms to simulate shoulders and torsos. They moved from position to position, conducting their deadly puppet show along the line, drawing fire from concealed snipers and pinpointing their locations for the heavy weapons teams to eliminate. By the afternoon of the 21st, they had neutralized 7 Japanese snipers, clearing a sector of the beachhead that had been paralyzed for days. The news traveled fast, passed from foxhole to foxhole in hushed whispers and excited shouts, inspiring other Marines to adopt the tactic. Soon, helmets on sticks were popping up all over Betio, a surreal army of ghosts rising from the sand to taunt the enemy. The Japanese snipers, conditioned to fire at any target that presented itself, found themselves wasting ammunition on empty steel and revealing their positions to a vengeful enemy. The psychological impact was devastating. The snipers, once the masters of the battlefield, were now uncertain, second-guessing every target, hesitant to pull the trigger for fear of exposing themselves to immediate retribution. Their effectiveness plummeted as their confidence eroded, the mathematical certainty of their kill ratios destroyed by a simple farm boy's trick. The Marines, sensing the shift in momentum, grew bolder, moving with greater freedom and aggression, pushing inland against the weakening Japanese defenses. But the Japanese were not an enemy to be underestimated, and their commanders quickly realized that a new game was being played. Orders went out to the sniper teams to hold their fire, to observe more carefully, to look for the telltale signs of a decoy before committing to a shot. The snipers began to ignore the solitary helmets, waiting instead for targets that moved, that breathed, that showed the unmistakable signs of life. The battle evolved into a complex duel of wits, a high-stakes poker game where the currency was life and death. Holland and his men had to up the ante, making their decoys more realistic, adding movement and behavior that mimicked the subtle nuances of a human being. They used ropes to make the dummies crawl, rigged simple mechanisms to make them appear to breathe, turning the battlefield into a theater of the macabre. On November 23rd, the third day of the battle, the Japanese deployed their master sniper, a legendary marksman known only as the Ghost of Betio. He operated from a deep, reinforced bunker in the center of the island, firing through a series of narrow slits that offered a commanding view of the American lines. He had killed 20 Marines in 2 days, his shots always fatal, his position impossible to locate. Parker's squad was pinned down by his fire, unable to move forward or back, trapped in a shallow depression with the sun beating down on them. Holland knew that the standard helmet trick wouldn't work on the Ghost. He was too experienced, too disciplined. They needed something better, something that would force him to make a mistake. Holland orchestrated a complex deception, coordinating with 3 other squads to create a multi-layered ruse. They built 6 high-quality dummies, complete with uniforms and rifles, and positioned them at different points around the bunker's perimeter. At a signal, they raised all 6 dummies simultaneously, creating a sudden flurry of activity that simulated a coordinated American assault. At the same time, a team of Marines laid down a base of suppression of fire, adding to the chaos and confusion. The Ghost, faced with multiple targets in an apparent attack, was forced to react quickly, snapping off shots in rapid succession. As he fired, the spotters in Parker's squad triangulated his position, marking the specific slit from which the muzzle flashes originated. With the target identified, the Marines didn't waste time with rifle fire. They called up a flamethrower team, covering their advance with smoke and suppressive fire until they were within range. A jet of liquid fire roared into the bunker's opening, incinerating everything inside and silencing the Ghost forever. When they later inspected the bunker, they found the sniper dead at his post, his rifle still aimed downrange, a testament to his dedication even in the face of annihilation. But alongside him lay the evidence of his confusion, empty shell casings scattered across the floor, shots fired in haste at targets that weren't real. The victory over the Ghost was a turning point, breaking the back of the Japanese sniper resistance on Betio. The Battle of Tarawa ended on November 23rd, leaving behind a landscape of utter devastation and a death toll that shocked the American public. Over 1,000 Marines lay dead, and nearly all of the 4,000 Japanese defenders had perished. Amidst the carnage, the story of Marcus Holland and his helmet decoys became a legend, a small but significant chapter in the larger history of the war. It was a testament to the ingenuity of the American soldier, the ability to adapt and overcome in the face of overwhelming odds. The tactics developed on Tarawa would be refined and used in future campaigns, saving countless lives as the war moved closer to the Japanese home islands. But for Holland, walking back to the beach past the rows of white crosses, there was no sense of triumph, only the heavy burden of survival and the memory of the friends who would never go home. The silence that fell over Betio on the morning of November 24th was heavier than the artillery barrage that had preceded it, a suffocating blanket of quiet that pressed down on the lagoon and the blackened palm stumps. For Marcus Holland, the cessation of noise was almost physically painful, his ears ringing with the phantom echoes of machine gun fire and the screams of the dying. The island, a mere 290 acres of coral sand, was now a graveyard for nearly 6,000 men, the air thick with the stench of death and cordite that no ocean breeze could scrub away. As the burial details began their grim work, bulldozing long trenches in the sand to receive the bodies of the fallen, Holland sat on a crate of ammunition near the shoreline, staring out at the gray steel of the transport ships. He cleaned his rifle with mechanical precision, stripping the bolt and scrubbing the carbon from the chamber, his hands moving with a rhythm that had been drilled into him until it replaced conscious thought. Beside him lay the helmet he had used as a decoy, now battered and scarred, a piece of metal that had taken a bullet meant for his brain. It was no longer just equipment. It was a talisman, a physical manifestation of the luck that had allowed him to draw breath while better men lay cold in the earth. In the days that followed the securing of the island, Marine intelligence officers began the painstaking task of sifting through the wreckage of the Japanese command bunkers, searching for maps, codes, and documents that could shed light on the enemy's defenses. Among the blood-stained papers and personal diaries recovered from the spider holes, they found frantic notes scribbled by Japanese snipers, entries that confirmed the devastating effectiveness of the American deception. One diary, belonging to a corporal in the Special Naval Landing Forces, described a ghost army that rose from the ground to taunt them, targets that refused to die even when shot through the head. The entry revealed a growing sense of paranoia and confusion within the Japanese ranks, a breakdown of discipline as their carefully cultivated doctrine of patience crumbled in the face of the inexplicable. These documents were forwarded to Pearl Harbor and eventually to the Pentagon, where they became footnotes in tactical manuals, stripping away the human element of Holland's improvisation and reducing it to a dry, lessons-learned bullet point. The military machine was efficient at absorbing innovation, but terrible at crediting the innovator. The helmet trick became standard operating procedure, but the name Marcus Holland did not travel with it. As the 2nd Marine Division rotated out of Tarawa, heading back to Hawaii for rest and refit, the tactic of the helmet decoy traveled with them, carried in the sea bags and memories of the survivors. It was discussed in mess halls and barracks, refined in training exercises, and passed down to new recruits as a piece of essential survival lore. By the time the Marines landed on Saipan in June of 1944, the ruse had evolved into a sophisticated counter-sniper doctrine. On Saipan, the terrain was different, mountainous, filled with caves and dense undergrowth, but the enemy was the same, and the need to draw their fire was just as critical. Marine squads began carrying specially constructed mannequin heads made of papier-mâché, painted to resemble human faces and mounted on collapsible poles. These Saipan SAMs, as they were nicknamed, were issued to point men and scouts, used to probe suspected ambush sites, and clear the cave mouths where Japanese defenders waited in the darkness. The crude improvisation of the wheat farm had been industrialized, mass-produced by a military establishment that finally understood the value of a target that couldn't bleed. Holland, promoted to corporal for his actions on Betio, found himself teaching the technique to fresh-faced replacements who looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. He emphasized the psychology of the crow, although he never used that specific analogy with the officers present. He taught them patience, the discipline to wait for the shot, the necessity of triangulation, and the cold, hard fact that in war, fairness was a concept for civilians. You give them what they want to see, he would tell the young Marines, holding up a helmet on a stick. You let them think they're winning. Let them think they've got the drop on you. And when they commit, when they pull that trigger and reveal their position, you crush them. It was a brutal philosophy, born of the trauma of Tarawa, but it saved lives. On Saipan, the casualty rates for officers and NCOs dropped significantly in units that employed the decoys, forcing the Japanese to abandon their sniper tactics and resort to suicidal banzai charges that were easily cut down by massed machine gun fire. The war ground on, moving inexorably toward the Japanese home islands, and the fighting grew more desperate and savage with every mile. On Peleliu and Iwo Jima, the Japanese defenders dug deeper into the volcanic earth, creating subterranean fortresses that were impervious to naval bombardment. The snipers became even more elusive, firing from tiny apertures in rock faces or from spider holes covered with iron lids that clanged shut the instant a shot was fired. The helmet trick had to be adapted again. Simple movement was no longer enough to fool the veterans of the Imperial Army. Marines began attaching cigarettes to the mouths of the dummy heads, using hidden rubber tubes to make them smoke, or rigging the decoys to jerk violently as if hit, playing dead to lure the Japanese into a false sense of security before the flamethrowers moved in. It was a macabre puppet show enacted in the black sand and sulfur, a testament to the terrifying adaptability of men pushed to the brink of endurance. By the time the invasion of Okinawa began in April of 1945, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, the decoy tactic had become an integrated part of Marine infantry maneuvers. Holland, now a sergeant, led a platoon through the muddy ridges of the Shuri Line, facing a fanatical defense that utilized every inch of the terrain. The rain on Okinawa was relentless, turning the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and rotting corpses. But the principles of the wheat farm held true. When his platoon was pinned down by a sniper operating from a tomb on a hillside, Holland didn't call for a frontal assault. He deployed 3 decoys simultaneously, creating a flurry of activity on the left flank, while a bazooka team crept up on the right. The sniper, confused by the sudden abundance of targets, hesitated for a crucial second, shifting his aim between the false threats. That hesitation was his death warrant. The bazooka round slammed into the tomb, obliterating the position in a flash of white phosphorus and high explosive. The end of the war in August of 1945 did not bring an immediate release from the psychological grip of the battlefield. For Holland, the journey home was a surreal transition from a world of absolute violence to one of mundane tranquility. He rode the train back to Kansas in silence, staring out the window as the landscape shifted from the blue of the Pacific to the golden waves of the wheat fields. The civilians on the train laughed and talked about rationing and the price of gasoline, oblivious to the fact that the man sitting in the corner was analyzing the tree line for sniper hides and checking the exits for ambush points. When he stepped onto the platform in liberal Kansas, there was no brass band, no ticker tape parade, just his father waiting in the old Ford truck, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that required no words. Holland threw his sea bag into the back and climbed in, the smell of dust and diesel fuel grounding him in a reality he wasn't sure he still belonged to. Reintegrating into farm life was a slow, agonizing process of rewiring a brain that had been tuned to the frequency of combat. The quiet of the nights was terrifying, the absence of incoming fire creating a void that his mind tried to fill with nightmares. He would wake up sweating, his hands reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, the sound of the ocean roaring in his ears. But the farm offered a rhythm, a cycle of planting and harvest that demanded his attention and forced him to focus on the living rather than the dead. He worked from dawn until dusk, driving the tractor, mending fences, burying his trauma in the physical exhaustion of labor. He never spoke about Tarawa or Saipan, never mentioned the helmet trick or the men he had saved. To his neighbors, he was just Marcus, the Holland boy who had done his duty and come home, a little quieter, a little harder around the eyes, but alive. Then came the harvest of 1946, and with it, the return of the crows. They descended on the fields just as they always had, a black plague that threatened to destroy the crop his family depended on. Holland stood on the porch, watching them swirl over the wheat and felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. He went to the barn and retrieved the old Winchester, along with a stack of old clothes and some lumber. He didn't build the simple scarecrows of his youth. He built the decoys of Betio. He constructed elaborate, articulated figures that moved with the wind, positioned them in triangulated killing zones, and set up his hide in the trees. When the crows came down to investigate the intruders, committing to their flight paths, Holland was waiting. He fired with the dispassionate efficiency of a sniper, dropping bird after bird, the math of the engagement playing out exactly as it had in the Pacific. It was a chilling moment of convergence. The skills of the soldier applied to the chores of the farmer, a reminder that the war had changed him in ways that could never be undone. In the decades that followed, the United States Marine Corps began to formally study the tactical innovations of the Pacific War, seeking to preserve the hard-won knowledge of the conflict. Military historians and tactical analysts sifted through the after-action reports, conducting interviews with veterans and compiling data on small unit engagements. The helmet decoy tactic was identified as a key factor in reducing casualties during urban and jungle combat, cited in manuals and taught at the sniper school in Quantico. However, the origin of the tactic remained diffuse, attributed to the collective ingenuity of the Corps rather than a single individual. Holland's name appeared in the files, a casualty report here, a roster list there, but the connection between the Kansas farm boy and the doctrinal shift was never officially made. He remained an anonymous architect of survival, his contribution woven into the fabric of Marine Corps history without the thread of his identity being pulled. It wasn't until the late 1970s that a curious historian, researching a book on the Battle of Tarawa, stumbled upon the diary of the Japanese corporal that had been recovered on Betio. The diary mentioned a specific sector of the beach where the ghost soldiers had first appeared, a sector held by Holland's platoon. Intrigued, the historian cross-referenced the location with Marine unit logs and found the casualty reports that showed the sudden drop in sniper kills on November 21st. He tracked down the surviving members of the platoon, men who were now grandfathers living in suburbs and retirement communities across America. In phone calls and letters, they all told the same story. The farm boy from Kansas, the helmet on the stick, the crow hunting logic that had turned the tide. For the first time, the narrative of Marcus Holland began to coalesce, moving from the oral history of the foxhole to the recorded history of the war. Holland was an old man by then, living in a retirement home in Wichita, his farming days long behind him. When the historian contacted him, asking for an interview, Holland was reluctant, dismissive of the idea that he had done anything special. "I just didn't want to get shot," he told the writer, his voice raspy with age. "And I didn't want my friends to get shot. It wasn't genius. It was common sense. You don't fight a man on his terms. You make him fight on yours." He refused to be painted as a hero, rejecting the label with the stubborn pride of his generation. To him, the heroes were the ones who hadn't come back, the boys like the gunnery sergeant on the beach who had died to teach him the lesson. He agreed to the interview only on the condition that the story focused on the men of his squad, on the collective effort of survival, rather than glorifying his own role. The book was published in 1982, bringing a measure of late recognition to Holland's story. It didn't make him famous, he wasn't invited to the White House or given a parade, but it brought a quiet validation to the few who knew. The Marine Corps Museum in Quantico eventually added a small display to their Pacific exhibit, a battered M1 helmet mounted on a bayonet with a plaque explaining the Tarawa ruse. Holland never visited the museum, never saw the display. He spent his final years sitting on the porch of the care home, watching the birds on the feeder, his mind occasionally drifting back to the white sand and the green jungle, to the terrible, beautiful math of the kill zone. He died in his sleep in 1995, a quiet end to a life that had been defined by a few days of deafening violence. His funeral was a modest affair, much like the life he had led since the war. But as the small procession gathered at the cemetery, a group of strangers arrived, men in their 70s wearing VFW caps and Marine Corps pins. They were the survivors, the men from Saipan and Okinawa and Iwo Jima who had learned the trick, or whose squad leaders had learned the trick, and who had lived to have children and grandchildren because of it. They didn't know Holland personally, but they knew the debt they owed. They stood at attention as the coffin was lowered, a silent honor guard for the man who had taught the Marine Corps how to hunt crows. As the bugler played taps, the notes drifting over the Kansas plains, one of the veterans stepped forward and placed a single object on the grave, a wheat stalk woven through the trigger guard of a spent rifle casing. The legacy of Marcus Holland is not written in bronze statues or marble monuments, but in the tactical doctrine of modern infantry. The concept of the decoy, of forcing the enemy to reveal themselves by engaging a false target, remains a cornerstone of counter-sniper operations to this day. From the jungles of Vietnam to the streets of Fallujah, American troops have used helmets on sticks, mannequins in windows, and thermal decoys to draw fire and neutralize threats. It is a lineage of survival that stretches back to a foxhole in Tarawa and a wheat field in Kansas, a reminder that in the chaos of war, the most powerful weapon is often the human mind's ability to adapt. Marcus Holland was not a general or a strategist. He was a private who looked at a problem and saw a solution, and in doing so, he proved that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to trick the enemy into fighting a ghost. Marcus Holland used a civilian hunting trick to change the course of a battle, yet he never sought credit for it. Do you think modern military training relies too much on technology and doctrine, losing the value of this kind of individual common-sense ingenuity? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.